Start by telling us a little bit about your relationship with Berg's Wozzeck. When did you first see it?
I was actually 13 years old when I first saw Wozzeck, just beginning to go and see live opera in the theatre. And because I was 13 years old, and it was actually one of the first operas I saw in the theatre, and I just didn't have a problem. I mean, I was just incredibly moved by it and overwhelmed by it and excited by it. But at that age, you don't perceive that there are any of the inherent problems which many people seem to associate with atonal music or the music of composers of this period. It was shattering, it was involving, it was incredibly exciting, it was incredibly theatrical. It stayed with me. I subsequently in my life have seen, I think, half a dozen more productions live in the theatre. And then eventually I was asked to do my own production, which was a bit of a surprise, but a very welcome surprise, and something I looked forward to tremendously and something I've enjoyed doing tremendously.
You've directed an enormously wide range of repertoire, but this is your first Wozzeck.
Yeah.
And that's exciting, because Wozzeck is unlike any other opera.
It is unlike any other opera. It's the first opera that kind of crosses the Rubicon and really begins from a basis of atonality. And the word atonality is quite scary to a lot of people, but you don't have to be scared. It's simply the method in which the composer has proceeded to write their music drama. But what Berg was intent upon doing was writing a music drama based on the play Wojciech by Georg Büchner, which he saw as a very young man in I believe, at the beginning of 1914, and was instantly moved by it and instantly knew that he had found the operatic subject that he wanted to begin his operatic writing career with. We mustn't forget that Berg's early ambitions were literary. He didn't begin to harbour musical ambitions until he was 15 years old, I believe. He was a late starter, and he sort of taught himself how to play the piano, and very quickly moved on to study composition with Arnold Schoenberg. You know.
Tell us a bit about the Vienna in which Berg was born and in which he grew up. It was a particular moment in time that is remarkable.
It's very, very hard for us to get into the mindset of the artistic fulcrum that Vienna was at this period at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's very hard for us to wrap our heads around now, sadly, how valuable art was, how exciting new artistic movements were, how deeply related they were to society as a whole, and how actually new movements in music, new movements in the performing arts, new movements in writing, new movements in architecture and the visual arts could actually fundamentally change society. It was that close a relationship, and it's something we don't have anymore, which is very, very sad. But I mean, his immediate circle, while he was a young composer and working with Arnold Schoenberg, I mean, his immediate friends would be like Adolf Loos, the architect, or the composers Schrecker and Zemlinsky. He knew Gustav Klimt. He was a very intimate friend of the political writer and satirist Karl Kraus. And there were Gustav Mahler was director of the Vienna State Opera, the Vienna Court Opera at that time. I don't know if anyone's read the autobiography by the Jewish Viennese writer Stefan Zweig, The World of Yesterday, but he was also a contemporary. And in the early chapters of this autobiography, which eventually is very tragic because Stefan Zweig ended up taking his own life in the early 1940s, he stresses how involved he, as a young man, felt in the cultural life of his city, and how his fellow school children, not even students, but like schoolboys, avidly devoured new poetry, avidly went to see new music performed, went to the Secessionist exhibition and were bowled away by it. This is something we've lost. what we're trying to say, what I'm trying to say is, when Wozzeck eventually emerges after the First World War in 1925, it was finally premiered. The rapidity with which the public took this very challenging score to its heart, because there was a receptivity towards someone writing in a completely new way, and an immediacy in the audience's response to Wozzeck when it was finally premiered. 25 premieres in Europe immediately after its Berlin premiere, 25 in quick succession. Its US premiere was, I believe, at the Philadelphia Grand Opera under Stokowski in 1931. All of this finished when the Nazis came to power, and Berg's artistic voice was silenced. And he chose not to become an emigre. He chose to try and live in Austria, and he died in Austria at the age of 50, but deprived of his voice. This is very sad.
Vienna before 1914, before World War I broke out, was a peculiarly conflicted society, because yes, as you say, there was this extraordinary multidisciplinary artistic, scientific movement erupting around Vienna in the context of an ultra-conservative, ultra-comfortable and self-satisfied high society environment.
A very self-satisfied political environment that considered it would just like roll along forever under the Habsburg emperors. Nothing was going to change in Austria, and I think that was the spur to these young artists who actually create such exciting art. But yes, certainly. But it was a world that after the Force-Nacian War in Europe vanished forever. And in the aftermath between the two wars, there was a sort of like regrouping, a remustering of everyone's artistic forces and social forces, just trying to work out where we now were. And unfortunately, the way things went in Germany and Austria, it went the wrong way. And it led to a further conflict, which of course changed the world again in an unalterable way.
But back to 1914, because that's when Berg first saw Büchner's play, Wozzeck, and was blown away by it and immediately wanted to turn it into an opera.
Every reminiscence of Berg's contemporaries that I've read stresses the man's empathy and compassion and his sense of civic responsibility. It was something that he really believed in, and he was deeply anti-militaristic, although he did serve in the trenches during the Force-Nacian War.
He was called up.
He was called up. He had no
option.
choice. Yeah. And he did serve, and he did actually get promoted towards the end of 16, I think.
He was a chronic asthmatic. So
he was not well.
He was invalided out, and then spent the second part of the war working in the Ministry of Defense.
Exactly. But being invalided out allowed him to concentrate on the composition of Wozzeck. But what he had personally experienced and what he was seeing around him and the collapse of the world he had known around him was a spur. I just want to read you a little quote I found. In 1918, he wrote to his wife, Helena, and he's talking about the composition of Wozzeck, and he says, "There is more than a little of me in this character, since I have spent these war years just as dependent on people I hate, have been in chains, have been sick, have been captive, have been resigned and humiliated." So part of the power for me of Wozzeck is that I believe is a deeply personal work, although it's based on an existent text written by an author in the previous century. And the experience of war was not the spur to write it, but I think the experience of war and what war does to people, what war does to societies, produced the scorching, aching music of this opera, and I think the agony of the opera, which is so relevant to us today.
One of the things that you and I have talked about is Berg's position as someone who was not wanting to contradict the tradition of great composition that he was inheriting, but to continue it. And you've talked about how he's different from Schoenberg and Webern, the other two most famous Second Viennese School composers, to that extent.
Schoenberg, his teacher, and Webern, his fellow student, they were definitely iconoclasts. They definitely wanted to tear up the rule book. Berg didn't want to do that. What he wanted to do, I think, was find a very personal voice as a composer. And I think in Schoenberg, as a teacher in the 12-tone system, he found a way of articulating his musical ideas. But the flip side to Berg's music is always this haunting tonality to his atonal music. And sometimes in Wozzeck and in Lulu as well, the orchestra and the singers will break out in full-blooded tonality at the most incredible emotional moments. Yeah. And he does that with a precise dramatic purpose. He acknowledged himself, I think in a letter to Webern, correct me, someone, if I'm wrong, he said, "Oh, we're all just old romantics at heart, aren't we?" Which, if you listen to some of Webern's music, is that's a very interesting description of Webern's music, but Berg included Webern within this description. Mm. It's certainly very true of Berg's music that there is a deliberate accessibility. As challenging as it may be to some people's ears, he does not want to alienate you. He wants to draw you in, and he wants to grab your heart, and he wants to grab your mind. He wants to make you think, but he wants you to feel at a very deep level. And that's what's so great about the only two operas we have from him.
Let's try to demystify the word atonality, because as you say, it is a scary word to many people. And it means something very specific and very straightforward. It simply means that the music is not anchored to a key signature or a series of key signatures, the way more romantic music from earlier in the 19th century is. And so ultimately it means that Berg, in adopting atonality, is simply creating for himself complete freedom in which he is able to minutely change the temperature from word to word, thought to thought, moment to moment, and as you say, entrance us and engage us with the characters and their relationships.
That's a very good description of what's going on in atonal music. Of course, none of that needs to matter to the audience as they listen to it. And Berg actually made a speech where he said, "I don't want any of you to understand the internal structures of this score. Right. I just want you to listen to it." You know, he found why musicians love doing this music is it's so fascinating. The way it's written, the internal structures, the way that there's no firm keys, the way that time notation keeps on changing, especially in the first act of Wozzeck, like every 3 or 4 bars. None of that actually matters, finally, in performance. That's how we perform it. We have to understand it. We have to anchor ourselves on this, otherwise we can't perform it. Because to give a good performance of this music, you absolutely must understand the structures. And I'm including myself in this. But the audience shouldn't give a damn. The audience should just respond to music theatre. And he used music theatre all the time. I mean, he wasn't particularly interested in creating a grand opera per se. He was interested in writing this play, which moved him so much he wanted to set it to music. The play itself drew music out of him. He couldn't help himself.
Which is why, as you said earlier, it's a perfect first-time opera-goer's opera, because you don't actually, as a member of the audience, need to understand the conventions of opera. You simply need to have open ears and open eyes and react to a play.
I think if you made up your mind that opera is La Bohème and Trovatore, you might have some problems with this. Let's be honest about it. If you need recognizable arias or recognizable ensembles, you're going to struggle. If you have a completely open mind, I really don't see that anyone's going to really have problems with this. It's just gripping drama, and may I say, the score is incredibly beautiful.
Yeah, Wozzeck is full of tunes. The tunes just last 2 seconds rather than 2 minutes.
Yes, but Stephen Sondheim's tunes last 2 seconds.
Exactly. Berg also wrote for an enormous orchestra and is a virtuosic orchestrator and uses the orchestra, as you've described, to draw us further and further into the emotions of the characters.
Yes, but also the vocal writing is extraordinary because
Right.
The tenor role of the captain is really, really interesting. And it's only the underdogs, and by the way, I'm digressing a little, but it's only the underdogs in the piece who have names, which is Wozzeck and Maria and Andres. Everyone else has a label. The persecutors are labels because they're symbols. The captain particularly is a caricature of a certain type of militarism and a certain militaristic society which Berg knew a lot about and his contemporary audience knew a lot about. And the vocal writing for the captain is extraordinary because he has extraordinary vocal leaps, sometimes into high falsetto and then down into the depths of his boots. And then sometimes he's like a machine gun firing this way of vocal writing which we call Sprechgesang or Sprechstimme, where the singer is asked to actually come off notes and is actually concentrating on rhythmic delivery of the text. And it is notated, but in the stave you get little crosses rather than notes. So like there's a kind of musical line which is being indicated, but more than anything else it's the rhythmic delivery that he's interested in. And he uses, and the part of the captain is the most extreme example, sometimes he sings wonderfully lyrical phrases when he's considering his own mortality and what his funeral might be like, which he does in one scene. And then when he wants to torment poor Wozzeck, it literally is like a machine gun. When he sings the name Wozzeck, it sounds like a rifle going off.
Yes. Contrast that, because we'll listen to an excerpt in a moment. Contrast that with the musical writing for Wozzeck. Our first excerpt, it comes from the end of Act 1, Scene 1, and opens with Wozzeck singing his wonderfully passionate monologue about poverty.
When the curtain goes up, to all intents and purposes, this opera is going to be about the captain. He's got the lion's share of the stage time. He sings all the time. He's clearly the main character. There's this inarticulate man who is shaving him and responding to him and just saying, Jawohl, jawohl, Herr Hauptmann, every so often. And then suddenly from nowhere bursts forth with this aria. It's actually described in the score as an aria. It doesn't feel like an aria because it doesn't announce itself. There's no big ba-dam, and here we go. The lead singer, suddenly the most peripheral character on stage reveals his state of mind. And then the captain emerges and immediately shuts him up. And in microcosm, you actually have the story of Wozzeck, because this is a man who feels catastrophe is approaching him and the world that he lives in, but does not have the articulacy, the means to express himself, because he is someone absolutely at the bottom of society and also someone that no one listens to.
Let's hear the first excerpt.
Ihr arme Leut, sehen Sie, der Hauptmann geht, wer kein Geld hat. Da setzt einmal einer seinesgleichen auf die moralische Art in die Welt. Man hat auch sein Fleisch und Blut. Ja, wenn ich ein Herr wär und hätt einen Hut und eine Uhr und ein Augenglas und könnt vornehm reden, ich wollte schon tugendhaft sein. Es muss was Schönes sein, die Tugend, Herr Hauptmann. Aber ich bin ein armer Kerl, unser Eins ist doch ein der Welt. Ich glaub, wenn wir in den Himmel kämen, so müssten wir anderen helfen. Schon gut, ich weiß, er ist ein guter Mensch. Ein guter Mensch, aber er denkt so viel, das zehrt. Er sieht immer so verhext aus. Der Diskurs hat mich angegriffen. Geh er jetzt und renn er nicht so. Geh er langsam die Straße hinunter, genau in der Mitte. Und nochmals geh er langsam, hübsch langsam.
Second voice you heard coming in was the voice of the captain, the tenor. And you heard an example of the extremity of his vocal writing. He's going up and he's going down because Berg is writing about a deranged mentality who is in a position of undeserved authority. Just think about the idiots that sent all those hundreds of thousands of men out into no man's land. And that is what that caricature is about. That's what he's talking about. But it's something he saw. It's a man that he knew. And that's why he's writing like that. Whereas when you hear Wozzeck singing in very broad, lyrical, very gratifying music to sing, as he says, if I wasn't poor, I could marry my girlfriend and our son wouldn't be a bastard, and I could afford to have morals, but I'm poor. And at the climax of his aria, he says, and even when I die, I'll be poor, and I believe if we get to heaven, they'll put us to work making the thunder.
The humanity that Berg instills in Wozzeck's character through the music is full of compassion. And I suppose if there is one word to signify the essence of this piece, it's compassion.
Yes, absolutely. Totally.
And that compassion is also expressed with extraordinary eloquence for Marie.
The soprano or mezzo-soprano role of Marie, the common law wife of Wozzeck, is the most... She possesses the most beautiful music in the whole opera, and she's normally on stage with her very small child, who's also an incredibly tragic figure. And we have a rather wonderful one at Lyric, may I say.
Very small.
Yes, very small boy. She has an exquisitely haunting lullaby in the first act, which is all about her devotion to the child, who she also torments, by the way, because she's stuck in a situation with no job and a kid, and depending on Wozzeck to give her whatever scraps from his pay that he can afford to give her so she can survive. And then at the beginning of the third act, after she has taken a chance at good luck by sleeping with one of Wozzeck's superiors, the drum major, and he's given her a pair of gold earrings, which Wozzeck finds her with. And later on, he sees her out dancing with his superior officer. And of course, there is nothing Wozzeck can do about that situation. And at the commencement of the third act, Marie is alone with her small child, and she's reading the Bible to him. She's riven with guilt. The child tries to embrace her. She pushes the child away. She immediately feels guilty about throwing her child onto the bed. She hugs the child, and she tells the child the saddest fairy tale imaginable. She tells him a story about a small boy whose parents both die. It's also a very good example of the use of Sprechgesang or Sprechstimme. And in this context, Berg uses it as Marie begins to read the Bible, by the way, in the German Lutheran translation, which is the language of the common Germans, but she's barely literate. So he uses her lack of literacy he expresses that through her Sprechgesang, and you hear the difficulty as this woman tries to form the words of the Bible.
Let's hear our second excerpt. Evelyn Lear as Marie. It's the recording conducted by Karl Böhm. In the
Karl Böhm.
The first excerpt, we had Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau as Wozzeck and Gerhard Stolzer.
Karl Böhm wrote a really disappointing letter to Berg.
Tell us more about that.
He wrote it in 1934.
Uh-huh.
He said, because I think he was in Kassel at that point. He said, for the time being, political circumstances, what they are, I'm sure you will understand I can no longer perform Wozzeck.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
Then he went on post-war to record it, actually magnificently.
Yes, so
60s.
Maybe he redeemed himself.
Maybe. Then it suited him to record it in the 60s.
I know, but Berg was desperate for the money.
Sure. David, talk a bit about how you approach a production. We have a conversation about, would you like to direct Wozzeck? You say you would. You tell me that you would like to
Very surprised you asked me.
There you go. You said you'd like to ask Vicky Mortimer to design the sets and the costumes, Paulie Constable to design the lighting. Just give us a sense of what happens next.
Oh gosh, well it's different with different designers.
Take Wozzeck as the example.
I'll take Wozzeck as an example. I began with this particular team because Vicky Mortimer has done a considerable body of operatic work, but principally designs for straight theatre. And I wanted a kind of like intrinsic detail to the design, which I didn't want broad strokes at all. I knew I would want to do a very humanistic and very human Wozzeck, and I felt that she would be the right person to do that. She's also great at looking at a period and researching it in incredible detail and then articulating it to an audience in incredible detail. Ditto Polly Constable's lighting, and I think lighting, the importance of lighting design is something that many people don't really understand or appreciate it, but I assure you emotionally, you may not be aware that your emotions are being manipulated by the lights, but actually, if it's a great design, they are. It's a very subtle and very clever thing, but Polly too has a very humanistic and passionate approach to her work. So I just felt these two ladies were the right team to approach this particular title the way that I wanted to do it. If I'd wanted to do a more expressionistic reading, I would have gone for a different team. Yeah. I simply didn't.
Yeah. And your production has an extraordinary design, and we were at one point tempted to bring some pictures to show you, but then actually we thought, no, you need to come and see it for yourselves. And just to whet your appetites, the design takes us into the world of a post-World War I city.
I mean, it absolutely is a universal story. Just doing the research on when Berg was writing it and how personally he identified with his character, Wozzeck, I just went, I'm going to set it in the period. I'm going to set it in 1919, 1920, the beginning of the Weimar Republic. I'm going to set it in that shattered society, that shattered world, because these are the people he's writing about, and that was the audience who first received it and took it to the heart, because the audience knew the composer was writing about them in such a vivid way. I'm not sure we can ever recapture that sense of this is about us, about our communal experience. It's why there were so many productions across Europe, the aftermath of war-torn Europe, and everyone responded to it, apart from the English. The English took their time. They got there eventually, but you know, the victors write history, I suppose. But
So we portray a desolate, destroyed world with one enormous exception. And as it's something that the audience see when they come into the opera house, I don't think it will spoil any surprises by talking a little about it. What you have when you come into the theatre is this giant, pristine, perfectly created war memorial.
yes.
And that perfect war memorial is...
But that war memorial, I think, is something that resonates with all of us now, because we're still building them. And we've all grown up with them, and we all know what those statues mean, or those great monuments mean. We all know it's about loss. We all know it's about our society undergoing change. We all know it's about pain in our lives. We can't look at one of those memorials without having some kind of emotional reaction to it. Even, you know, where I live in England, in the small town of Lewes in Sussex, we have a 1914-18 war memorial at the crossroads of our high street. And on Armistice Day, still, the whole town comes out and stands around this thing, and what veterans we have left will parade. I think that's a really, really common experience, you know, the world over. This kind of sense of agony and loss and futility. And I think those emotions are dredged up by Wozzeck. So I do like our war memorial. I think it is a good thing to place strongly at the center of the stage and build our story around.
But one of the things that I find so wonderful about it is that it is pristine and everything else is destroyed.
Everything else is shattered.
And so it's almost an insult to these poor people who are having to live their lives in the most desolate of circumstances. Clearly, if you just for a moment think it through literally and dramaturgically, that community has gone to the trouble of creating this war memorial while at the same time allowing people to live in utter desolation.
Yes.
Our third excerpt is purely orchestral, but it's really an emotional climax of the piece. Tell us a bit about it. It's the
This,
last interlude.
Throughout the score of Wozzeck, every scene change is accompanied by an interlude in the orchestra, shades of Peter Grimes. Well, Peter Grimes is very much influenced by Wozzeck. Normally they're very short. One of them is only 2 bars long, which is very interesting for us to change the set in 2 bars, but we manage it. And then the penultimate, the final actually interlude, after the penultimate scene, which is the scene where Wozzeck has murdered Marie and then has drowned himself trying to get rid of the bloody knife in a pond. The orchestra meditates. In a way, what Berg is doing is it's like a Bach passion, but a Bach passion for the loss of an inarticulate common man, someone who simply was born with no chance.
He describes it as an appeal to humanity through its representatives. It asks why.
You see what I mean when I say that when he wants to hit you in your heart, tonality bursts forth. It's the most extraordinary piece of composition, that interlude. It speaks in ways that you cannot quite put into words.
It's compassion as music.
And its agony and its sense of pain and its sense of loss, I just think are amazing.
Yeah. Questions, ladies and gentlemen. Who would like to ask Sir David some question?
When you saw this at 13, it wasn't in your native language. Now almost everyone who sees this opera is seeing it with surtitles, which means that it seems like that would change, make it easier for them to appreciate it, but how does that change your role too?
Well, when I saw it, it was in German and we didn't have surtitles, and we all managed somehow. I'm not a fan of surtitles myself because I don't think in the theatre, you're going to hate me for saying this.
No, you carry on.
I don't think in the theatre the audience should be spending all the time with their eyes flicking to the top of the proscenium. I think the audience should be focused on the actors. It's quite interesting. I actually saw the same production in Scotland within 2 years of each other, and the first time they did it in German, second time they did it in English translation. I preferred it in German, without surtitles. I mean, we do have some very good surtitles here at Lyric, which I think are very succinct and very close to the German, and hopefully are so succinct that the audience are not having to flick all the time to the top of the stage. And we've also done something with the surtitle board that we've managed to incorporate it into the design. So it sits a little lower. It doesn't feel that it's divorced from the total design. And I think if you have to deal with these wretched things, sorry, Anthony, I think that's the way to go.
Other question?
I'd like to hear from both of you a little more about what do you think we might do to begin the process of trying to recreate some more of the sensibility that you were sharing with us earlier that was now being lost. Unfortunately, now it's less and less of the younger people, although the Lyric are making great efforts to, get younger people in the audience, but it's a real problem because there's a threat to opera itself because of all of that.
After you, and then I'll...
Well, I can be more bullish, I can be less political. Until the politicians realize that there's votes in the arts, it's not going to happen. And until the politicians do their jobs properly, which we know none of them do, either here in America or where I come from, until they understand that they have a civic responsibility as leaders of our society to understand that art makes life more bearable, more livable, and art is a right for children. But if you deprive them in their education system, they're not going to be interested. And that is what it's like oxygen, oxygen being cut off to the souls of children, in my opinion.
Which is the perfect cue for me to wave the Chicago flag, because, as I hope you all know, the Chicago public school system has restored the arts as a compulsory core curriculum subject, which is an incredibly important step in the right direction. Chicago also has a group of wonderful arts organizations and cultural organizations who are now keen to work with the CPS in order to ensure that that commitment to arts education is taken as far as it possibly can in collaboration with Lyric, with the Chicago Symphony, and other arts organizations.
And I believe that across the board, just in our art form, in opera, I think we have to find ways to work with politicians and opera companies to not just do outreach work, which is incredibly important, but find a way to get the children into the theatre to see a main stage, full-scale opera production performed at the highest level, because that's what I saw when I was a young, curious, not particularly intelligent teenager, but curious enough, and it grabbed me. It actually led to my career, not in opera. I wanted to become an actor, which I did for a bit, and I directed straight theatre before I moved into opera, but I mean, I would not have had that desire if I had not had those experiences. It's absolutely vital that these two things, I think, go hand in hand.
Another question?
I noticed that Lyric is pushing very prominently the fact that this is a 100-minute adventure. Is this sort of a capitulation and saying Hey, it's only an hour and a half. You can take it.
Well, yes, I'm not embarrassed to answer your question by saying yes. The fact that it is a short opera in an age in which attention spans seem to be shrinking is a point that we are making very forcibly. In a way, it echoes the point we were making earlier, that this is an ideal first opera for someone who loves theatre, who loves movies, and it's shorter than many movies that have been released this week. So yes, it's only 100 minutes long. So please come and see it. Another question?
I'm a teacher, English teacher at a private school here in Chicago, and our school hosted the children's opera, if you remind me.
Second Nature.
Second Nature.
Yes.
And I went to it. I was curious, and I liked it very much. And one could think, wow, this is pretty difficult for young kids. And this little girl, I just asked her, how was it? She goes, I liked it. And I said, well, what did you like about it? She said, well, I didn't like the acting so much, but I really liked the music. So it doesn't get much better than that.
Right.
I mean,
We were
was
both
really
at
wonderful.
that same performance at Francis Parker School, I guess.
Yeah.
No, it's fascinating because the composer you're talking about is Matthew Aucoin, a brilliant young American composer, librettist, poet, pianist, conductor, essayist, who's 25 years old. And I suppose the way I would describe his music is that it has a contemporary medium, a contemporary sound world, as you would expect from a young composer composing in 2015. Kids have universally responded to it with great enthusiasm. Their grandparents sometimes haven't. But it is the kids for whom we have commissioned this piece. David, what was your impression of that performance and that audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, agree. Yeah, very much so. I don't think the kids had a problem with it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And in a way, Wozzeck is a good comparison because those kids had open ears. They didn't try and assess that music in comparison with Puccini or with Donizetti. They simply listened to it and it communicated directly to them. I think, let me ask you this as a final question. Why should people come to Wozzeck?
That is why should people do anything? Why should they come and see any theatrical performance? Because hopefully they're going to be enriched by it. I mean, I can't promise you're going to be enriched by it. I hope you will be enriched by it. It's certainly been our aim. It's been our aim because what we've all tried collectively to do, and talking about the entire cast as well as my colleagues and me and Lyric, is to do justice to what Berg wrote, to do justice to this score, to let the score speak, to let the composer speak through us and say what he wanted to say. We all believe what he wanted to say was coruscating and agonizing and vitally important. But I've hardly ever done a production where I didn't believe that it was vitally important. Trovatore is one I didn't, I'm sorry to say. But this one, I believe so passionately in this music and in this story and in what we're trying to say. So, I mean, yes, I want people to come and see it, and I want people to have a great time in the theatre, but I want them to think deeply. And if they haven't heard this music before, I want them to be transformed by it, absolutely.
Ladies and gentlemen, how can you resist that invitation? Sir David McVicar, thank you so much.
Thank you.